So let me start off by thanking all of you for joining. This webinar is being recorded, and if you have any questions, I suggest you use the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll have somebody read those off to me at the end and get all your questions answered. My name is Joe Daniel. I'm a principal at RMI on the carbon-free electricity team, and it was a great honor to be able to contribute to this work. I'm joined today by several of my co-authors, Kaya, Jeremy, and Albert, who are all off video right now, but they'll be joining us for the Q&A. Let's see, there we go. Quick overview of the agenda. We'll talk about how we got to where we are with fuel adjustment clauses, how this creates what we describe as a moral hazard, and explain some alternatives. But the real focus of today's call is to hear from you all and to facilitate answers to any questions that you might have. So I'm going to try to go over our slides relatively quickly. I encourage you all to read the full report. There'll be a link at the end if you want additional details, or to ask any questions. Again, there's a Q&A function on Zoom that you all can take advantage of. So before fuel cost recovery was done sort of on an automatic basis, the way costs got recovered was through rate cases. If a utility set base rates and actual costs were above what they were able to recover, investors lost, and the utility would come in for a rate case, and they would set new base rates. And at the time, typically based off of historical costs, so the new base rates would be higher. And in an age or era of consistently rising costs, this can be incredibly dangerous for investors. But in a situation where there's declining costs, there's opportunity for surplus, but not a lot of incentive for the utility to go into those rate cases and reduce rates. So the investors weren't really winning when costs were consistently rising, and consumers weren't really winning when the costs were falling. But that was pretty much the way things ran from 1907, when utilities first started being subject to rate regulation, through the 1970s. The two major notable exceptions were World War I and World War II, when temporary fuel pass-through clauses were passed. Except for they were always, we always reverted back to traditional rate making at the end of those events. In the 1970s, with the energy crisis ended at the end of the 70s, but the fuel pass-through clauses remained intact. So how do those work? Well, in most states, this is still the law of the land. So probably you might be, a lot more familiar with how these work, but quickly to describe it, essentially, you'll have a producer of a fuel, say oil or gas or coal, that sells it to the utility, and then the utility burns it to produce electricity and charges the customer, and the customer pays that cost, and it passes through the utility essentially straight to whoever's producing the raw fuel. If fuel costs go down, there is a savings that get passed along to customers. If fuel costs go up, that increase in costs get passed through to customers. Now, this seems to have a certain logic to it, right? The customers benefit from lower costs, but have to still have to pay the cost of higher costs. But it creates a moral hazard, because the utility is the one making the investments in what resources to build and what resources to retire. They're negotiating the contracts for the fuel, but they're not ultimately responsible for any volatility in that fuel price, for any financial consequences. Somebody else pays the bill, but they get to make all the decisions. And this isn't to say that what they're doing is immoral or even surprising. I mean, they're doing exactly what we would expect. The incentives are set up to do. If you look at a utility that's vertically integrated and has fuel pass-through clauses, they have no incentive to manage their fuel costs. But an independent power provider who's subject to market revenues really has a huge incentive to keep their fuel costs as low as possible. So they might have a large team managing fuel costs, managing contracts, engaging in hedging, whereas the utility that is not subject to that price volatility has no incentive to invest in those resources. But it also creates an unfairness to the other assets on the system. If a utility can run a power plant that is otherwise uneconomic and just pass through those losses to customers, then there's some other resource that's not being used, right? In any given moment, the electric sector is essentially a zero-sum game. So if utilities are, inefficiently or uneconomically operating a power plant because they can pass through those costs, some other resource is directly being harmed. There's also a fairness issue for the other industries that consume natural gas, methane. If you're an agricultural consumer or an industrial consumer, there's no way you can compete with a utility who essentially is not only is completely price insensitive. So that makes the price volatility particularly acute on customers, and again, the other industries really can't compete. And then finally, because these costs get passed through to low-income customers, to all customers, the volatility can be particularly acute for energy insecure or low-income users. Spiking bills can be incredibly challenging. Unexpected costs might be difficult to pay and might start to initiate this cycle of energy poverty because they fall behind on their energy bill and then they incur fees. And I don't want to go too far into that. That's a different webinar on how to make energy more affordable. But this, we think, fuel cost sharing, managing fuel costs, is one way that we can make energy more affordable. So we explore in our paper 6 alternatives, what we call the fuel cost true-up removal, fuel cost sharing, an efficiency ratio, fuel risk reduction tariffs. We also make suggestions around increasing access to information and better planning and procurement practices. So let's get into the list of alternatives. So the first one, which might seem a little bit obvious, is just to revert back to the pre-1970s way of rate regulation, where if you want to get your fuel costs increased or decreased, you have to come in for a full rate case. There's a couple of reasons why this might be challenging. One is that the price volatility and over-reliance on volatile fuels makes this an incredibly risky financial proposition for the investors. 2, rate cases are long, they're expensive, and to have to go into these every single time prices spike might not really be beneficial for any intervener group. So this may not be the most realistic alternative, but there are some cases where it might make sense, and particularly in places where you might have a multi-year rate plan and you have a lot of fixed contracts and costs that are much more predictable and much more steady than, say, a utility that's heavily reliant on fuel like natural gas or oil that's going to have a lot of price volatility in those costs. The second idea that we talk about is fuel cost sharing. And fuel cost sharing has been adopted by a number of states. And essentially the way it gets built out is by building a fuel budget. So looking at a load forecast and fuel price forecast and running a production cost simulation and saying, all right, the utility for this period of time can spend this much money on fuel costs. If they're on budget, that's great. If they're below budget, then some of those savings go to customers and some of them go to investors. And if they're over budget, some of those overages still get paid for by customers, but some of them get picked up by investors. So, the exact numbers are going to depend on the specific policy numbers that you pick when you're developing a fuel cost sharing mechanism in your state. But it essentially forces the utility to have a little bit of skin in the game and hopefully encourage them to make better decisions. Now, how you structure this fuel cost sharing is going to be not just state specific, but utility by utility specific, because it is, you're going to want a higher fuel cost sharing mechanism for utilities that have more stable fuel prices, because they're going to be able to absorb more of that, whereas utilities that are reliant on a lot of volatile fuel prices, even a little bit of cost sharing can create a huge financial incentive for them. The third idea that we came up with, we coined the efficiency ratio. It is similar to fuel cost sharing, but it attempts to normalize the fuel budget in terms of megawatt hours. This has the benefit of being a lot more controllable for things like weather and load fluctuation. So there are some advantages to it. There's also just a simplicity of like an efficiency ratio and normalizing it that I think is very attractive. The result is, if fuel costs increase and they don't do a good job of increasing that efficiency, the customers still see a bill increase, but it's less than what it would otherwise be. And if you see a decrease in fuel price, the investors get to keep some of that, but customer bills are still lowered. One of the drawbacks of this is that it's not well tested. There's no state that's done this, which means that some of the unintended consequences and trappings that might exist for this policy are not really well fleshed out, unlike the fuel cost sharing. But it is a policy that we have seen be a lot more attractive to utilities. So if you're in a state where you want to collaborate with the local utility, this is probably going to be something that's a lot more attractive to them than fuel cost sharing, which might be seen as a little bit too rigid. Then there are fuel risk reduction tariffs. And whereas the previous ideas that we've talked about kind of apply to everybody, this is a way of allowing for some sort of opt-in tariff so that the customer classes or subclasses can opt in to having a little bit more security in their bill, in an attempt to shift the risk away from them back on the utility and the investors. This has been done in a couple of states, particularly in states that are fully restructured. There's probably some really good examples of this. In vertically integrated states, there's often a true-up still, and so that doesn't really shift that risk away from customers. So we want to make sure that you're structuring this in a way that not only prevents the individual who opts in to actually have that price certainty, but also doesn't just like create a cost shift to other ratepayers. Number 5 of the 6 ideas is increased planning and procurement. Now, lots of states already have long-term planning through integrated resource planning, but not all of them adopt best practices in managing price volatility or running scenarios on what happens when fuel prices either go higher or lower than expected. To that end, there's also a lot more scrutiny that utility commissions and interveners can put on fuel price projections. One of the ideas that we talk about in the report is if you don't want to apply fuel cost sharing to all resources, what you could do is you could say, all right, when you justify building a new gas plant, you have that assumption is based off of a load and gas price forecast. And you can lock that price forecast in and say, listen, you are building this gas plant instead of some other resource, likely a clean resource, because you're saying it's lower price. Well, that wind or solar PPA was going to be fixed, and you're essentially creating a parity of the fixed price certainty of a renewables PPA with building new generation like a gas plant. We also recommend adopting things like all-source procurement and solicitation, requiring fuel management plans, and exploring changes to hedging practices as ways of managing fuel costs. And the last thing we identify is transparency. And this is something that's really, I think, surprising for folks who work in one state. When they go to a new state, they'd realize that the transparency rules and the confidentiality rules can vary tremendously. So you have states like Kentucky, which has a explicit in-state code, requires that the utilities provide for public view all fuel contracts. So they're required to make them public. In New Mexico, you can put in for discovery and eventually get a copy of the supply agreement. In Montana, you might get something, but it might be redacted. And in Texas, you might just get a piece of paper that says it's confidential. And the irony here is, we chose this New Mexico and Texas example because it's the same power plant. It's the same coal contract, but in one state, the interveners can get the information, and in the other state, they can't. So by allowing for transparency, there's a lot of things that you can do. One is you can better benchmark your utilities to neighboring states, to neighboring power plants. You can review the common practices of others and see, hey, is my state in line with best practices or out of line? I remember, getting to be able to review the very first fuel contract I ever reviewed was a coal contract, and it was under a confidentiality agreement, so I'm not going to share too many details. But I remember there being a clause in there that said if it was uneconomic to dispatch the power plant, the utility could waive the liquidated damages associated with the contract, which was a clause that the utility had never exercised. And the commission should have visibility into the fact that that clause exists and be able to scrutinize why a utility would or wouldn't exercise such a clause. So these are our 6 recommendations. I went through them in about 15 or 16 minutes. So I know I covered a lot in a very short period. Here's a link to our report. And I'm going to ask the other co-authors to come onto video and open up for Q&A for folks to ask us what might be on their front of mind.
All right, thank you, Joe. The first question is, why aren't prudence reviews enough? Do we really need something more elaborate?
Well, I'll throw that over to Kaya to answer.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Joe. So a prudence review, I'm not sure that, Joe, if you talked about this, but one of the things that we actually recommend in this report is to strengthen as one potential option for increasing access to information is to actually strengthen the quality of prudence reviews. So basically, the regulator going through what the utility brings for cost recovery and really being careful to assess whether it was truly the best option for customers at lowest cost, whether the utility did its due diligence to try to keep those costs down. Now, usually in fuel cases, these prudence reviews don't tend to be very in-depth. It varies by state, but in a lot of times they do tend to be pretty cursory. So I think the question is basically, could you strengthen a prudence review enough that you don't need these other kind of reforms, presumably? So the main thing there is that while strengthening prudence reviews is great and definitely recommended, there still remains a problem of information asymmetry between the utility and the regulator. And for fuel costs, this is fairly marked, I would say, because it's very hard sometimes for the regulator to figure out, and for other stakeholders as well, to really understand if the utility had other options, perhaps other potential fuel contracts it could have gotten if it worked a bit harder, or other even generation options that it could have, or demand side options that it could have leveraged more. So it's difficult, and because of that information asymmetry, having a mechanism in place like fuel cost sharing, for instance, which creates an actual incentive financially for the utility to really work hard to keep its fuel costs down, can be beneficial. But more in-depth prudence reviews are also a good idea.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Kaya. And I'll add to that in some cases, like the example that I gave, that was part of a regular prudence review where we discovered this clause that the utilities could be exercising. So in that state and that particular circumstance, it did work. But, I've asked those same set of questions in other states and not been able to even get a view onto the contract. Oftentimes, once the contract is signed, it's considered kind of over with. And then the only question is, with that being accepted as truth, did the utility make the right decisions to burn that coal or gas? When there is a larger question to be had of should they have built that gas plant or entered into that contract in the first place? And some of these other practices are going to just help align the financial incentives to make sure the utility does the best job in delivering low-cost, reliable energy to their customers.
All right, thank you. And just as a reminder to the audience that the Q&A function is open if you'd like to submit more questions there. The next question is a little different. As microgrids start taking load off of the grid's primary power plant sources, how do all customers share in the cost reductions?
Oh, that is a loaded question. There's lots of cost allocation, rate design, all sorts of juicy things built into there. Kai, I'm happy to have you if you want to respond. I'm happy to have this. Is, I think, a little bit beyond the scope of the paper, but I know this is something that you've spent time thinking on. So I'm happy to open up the yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to take this. And just up front, I'll just say I don't consider myself a microgrids expert, so feel free to submit another question if I didn't understand exactly what was being asked here. But I think in this context, I mean, like Joe just said, there's a lot of aspects of microgrids that will need to be dealt with in the regulatory context in different ways. But when we're talking about fuel cost sharing or fuel cost reforms in particular, oftentimes microgrids are discussed as being powered by renewables, batteries, that sort of thing, not necessarily like a fuel-based resource. So you could imagine that, okay, if the local microgrids, as the use of those grows, you could actually have lower fuel costs because the utilities, big plants, wouldn't be getting run as much, presumably, as those other resources are put there, so they can be islanded if necessary. So there may be a bit of a shift towards a lower fuel usage situation. So I'm kind of assuming that may be where this question was headed. If that is the case, I would just say that in general, if you were to adopt something like, say, fuel cost sharing, where the utility actually has a financial incentive to reduce fuel costs, it could make the utility more inclined potentially to support microgrid development based on renewables and storage and things that would otherwise basically necessitate more usage of fuel, because it would actually potentially get a financial incentive by that reduced usage that could follow. Now, I think there's a legitimate question, if the utility is not necessarily the main one developing those microgrids, depending on the situation, should it be given a financial incentive for doing that? Good questions. But if that was the question, then I would say that this could actually potentially motivate the utility, or at least it would maybe a bit support its incentive to support further renewables and battery deployment in a distributed fashion in the context of microgrids.
Great. Thank you for, I think I haven't seen any other follow-up questions, so I think you covered what they were looking for. And so next, have you seen utilities deferring under recovered fuel costs for a couple of years and charging WACC rate on it, while at the same time earning cost of capital on rate base, which includes allowance for fuel cost and delayed revenue recovery? And if you need me to read that again, I can try.
I've got the question here, looking at it. So that's really that's helpful. So have you seen deferring costs and then basically earning their weighted average cost of capital on a fuel deferment? Is that, that's essentially what I'm reading into this. The only thing close to that I can think of is actually a really recent examples where during the recent storms, there was huge price spikes, and then utilities amortize those costs either through securitization or some other means. And I actually don't know if in any of those examples they were allowed the weighted average cost of capital. So Albert, I don't know if you could see the question or if you know which examples I'm referring to, but happy to have you weigh in here.
Well, I haven't seen any particulars or examples, but I think we all know utilities usually feel like they are entitled to recover their cost of capital anytime they put up money up front. So it's not surprising they would like it. I just don't know if that's something they regularly get. Most fuel costs, the bulk of fuel costs, are covered kind of through the fuel clause procedure or a legislative process that's on a regular schedule. And in those cases, generally, they are not getting any additional compensation. So I don't know what the threshold is. I guess it'd be interesting to see as fuel costs in certain volatile fuels like natural gas get larger, to see if that exposure creates a greater incentive for them to ask for some kind of compensation. But I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, and I can just chime in. I mean, I'm also, my main answer is just I'm not sure. I mean, usually there is a balancing account that tracks the difference between the actual and the expected fuel costs, and that's what's the true up is based on. So it can go up and down. So if you end up with an under recovery for a number of years, and if there is a carrying charge at the WACC applied to that, then yeah, you could end up with this situation. I don't happen to know to what degree that's happened, or even if a carrying charge is usually applied to those, to be honest. So I also am not sure.
Luckily, we have expert John Wilson on the call who chimed in and shared this, and I'll go ahead and read it aloud for our viewing audience who might be watching it later. In the fuel cases I've reviewed, this is John speaking. It is common for the deferred balance credit to earn a return. In some cases, that may be a debt cost rather than the weighted average cost of capital. Thanks, John. Appreciate you weighing in there.
All right, very good. Would the remedies you shared work largely the same for methane gas distribution companies? We are seeing huge price volatility there as well.
I'll go ahead and answer that one because it's a pretty quick and straightforward. I think our paper was written for and entirely focused on vertically integrated electric utilities. There are some examples that we talk about that could apply to gas distribution companies, but they weren't specifically envisioned for that type of company.
Perfect, thank you. So the electricity system is already decarbonizing. Isn't this problem going to solve itself over time?
I love that question. And I've already done a lot of talking in the past 30 minutes. So I'm going to hand it over to Kaya first to see to get her response.
Sure. So, I mean, eventually, presumably, yes, if we get to the point that there's no fuel, not counting nuclear, of course, but if you get to the point that you're not reliant on fuel, you won't have a fuel potential cost containment issue. However, we probably have a ways to go before we get to that point. So in the near term, these solutions could be really useful to help keep costs down, since costs for fuel continue to be a relatively large share of customer bills in many jurisdictions, like on the order of 20, even 30% of the electric bill. Also, as I think Joe touched on, I believe, also some of these measures, not all of them, but some of these measures could actually incentivize the utility to look for ways to reduce fuel usage, not just the price of fuel, but also usage. So say shifting your generation portfolio more towards renewables and fuel-free resources, and shifting towards, basically less carbon-intensive sources. So some of these solutions also could help encourage utilities to look for ways to decarbonize quicker, or at least to kind of, as a side effect, end up decarbonizing quicker. So I think that there's a near-term potential decarbonization benefit to reforming these 100% pass-through policies.
Yeah, thank you, Kaya. I'll also add, in the report, we talk a little bit about how some of these policies would interact with, say, electrification policy, and help either encourage or need additional caveats to make sure that it doesn't discourage electrification. I think there's going to be two things that would arrest the energy transition. The first is like a major reliability issue caused by renewables, which luckily has not happened. The second is for energy to become so unaffordable as a result of renewables. And the more we can reduce fuel costs, the more affordable the transition is going to be, and the easier it is for the transition to actually occur the way it's supposed to. So this is definitely like a great transition policy to help facilitate that. And even if your particular state is not concerned about a decarbonization transition, it's a good affordability policy. So really, this is something that like should gain traction in utility commissions, regardless of their climate policy orientation.
Perfect. Thank you. And this next one is looking for specific examples. Are there any recent examples within the last 10 years of utilities or commissions adopting fuel cost true-up removal or fuel cost sharing?
Albert, do you want to take the first stab at that?
Well, as a general rule, keep in mind that the vast majority of states have done nothing but a fuel adjustment clause as described by Joe. So when we're talking about what states have tried, we're talking about approximately 8 to 10 that have tried. And I would say the effectiveness based on size of impact of all these policies relative to the fuel costs so far has been pretty small. And that's why we need your attention to this matter, because we all know the fuel cost is big and it's getting volatile, but really the answers, I think, are still out there. We still have to search, find, refine, and improve the tools that are available to address it. So the summary answer is there have been some attempts, but I would say none have been very effective, at least to date. And Kaya, I don't know if you want to add more, Joe, on any particulars on that, but my general feeling is we're only getting started. It's an old policy that's newly being relooked at in a changing world, and we have yet to discover the new tools and policies we need.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Oh, Kai, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in to say that in terms of last 10 years, a number of these fuel cost sharing policies were instituted more than a decade ago. I don't happen to have in my head exactly what the dates are. Some of them have been updated over time, so I think it depends on what you mean. But generally, this isn't like the fuel cost sharing that's in place in states right now. It hasn't all just happened in the last couple of years. Some of it's been there for a bit longer than that. As for fuel cost true-up removal, we're not aware of any commissions in the states that have implemented that since adopting a 100% pass-through policy. But as Joe noted earlier, that was the norm for many years. So it doesn't mean that we couldn't go back to it if you approached it in a reasonable way and a careful way, especially for utilities that are less reliant on volatile fuels. Yeah.
Thank you, Ed, for that question. I'll add two things if I may. One is something I forgot to mention in the presentation was that in some states, fuel pass-through has been codified by law, and so in order to pass a fuel cost sharing mechanism, you would have to change the law. And Colorado just did that. So Colorado passed authorizing legislation to allow for the commission to implement fuel cost sharing to whatever extent they see fit. And we've seen other state legislatures start to explore this. And not just in blue or purple states. South Carolina had a legislative session and was inquiring about this policy. So we see it as something that, again, just because of how volatile prices have been recently, it's something that could gain traction in a number of states.
Right. And speaking of volatile fuels, there's a question here about nuclear. Do states that use fuel cost sharing use it typically for coal and gas, or is nuclear included as well?
Kaya, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. Generally, the states that have these policies in place do include fuels as well as actually purchase power, and they'll oftentimes have a mechanism that includes both or two kind of parallel mechanisms. So while we're talking mostly about fuel cost sharing, because that is the bigger concern and where the moral hazard problem mainly lies, generally these mechanisms are set up to look at the total power cost or net power cost or some construct like that. So it would also include nuclear.
Perfect. Thank you.
To just take that one step further, nuclear power plants, their price can be volatile during the construction phase, but generally, once they've been built, their forward-going costs are pretty well known, and so you're not going to see a lot of volatility in a nuclear plant's operation costs. Not a lot of volatility in a PPA with a nuclear power plant. Same thing with wind and solar; those are usually baked into the contract, so you have a much higher level of certainty with those types of resources than with oil or gas or even coal. Coal is probably the most stable, but even if you look at the past 3 years, even that notion of coal being a stable fuel price is starting to have indications that might not be true going forward.
All right, thank you. And a little hypothetical scenario here. So in order to safeguard ratepayers, one might think of incentives for utilities to manage the fuel cost efficiently. If there are savings, sharing can be 50-50 between the utility and customers. And if there are losses, 100% losses for the utility. Are there such performance-linked fuel cost management practices prevalent? Do they exist?
Sure. So this is one of the elements of fuel cost sharing and the efficiency ratio that we didn't talk about in the webinar, but we did talk about at great length in the paper. So this has to do with the amount of sharing and the symmetry. So Kai, can you talk a little bit more about the sharing percentage and what is pretty typical in states that have fuel cost sharing?
Sure. Yeah. Usually, so I mean, it does vary, but generally the sharing percentage, if it's just a straight sharing percentage where it's like any savings are shared this percent and any losses are shared this percent, it's not usually as high as 50%. It's generally more on the order of 5%, 10%, maybe 20, something in that general vicinity. As for symmetry, yeah, there are some mechanisms that are asymmetrical where there is, say, more sharing of savings with customers than losses. In general, I think that if regulators are, considering such a mechanism, they should think about the potential downsides as well as the benefits of doing that, because it can create some less even incentive. Well, by definition, it creates a less even incentive structure for the utility, and so it may end up with the result that if there's already going to be some savings, the utility might be less motivated to look for further savings if they're not going to be able to retain very much of that, while they might work harder to avoid losses if they have to bear a larger percentage of those. So I think that fuel cost sharing, at least in any form, I would consider performance linked, because that was part of the question. If this asymmetrical sort of mechanisms out there, and if there are performance linked management practices out there. And I'd say even if you don't have an asymmetrical mechanism, you just have like the same percentage borne by the utility, whether it's on the upside and on the downside. Even so, that does create a performance incentive in the sense that it fixes a performance incentive problem that exists right now, which is that the utility has no real incentive financially to work to manage its fuel costs, because it's just not really a business expense from their perspective. It's something that customers pay. But yeah, you can set up asymmetrical mechanisms, I guess, is the short answer, and those have been used in some places.
All right, thank you. And just to return to the earlier discussion of nuclear, this is to Joe. The question is the Grand Gulf nuclear facility an outlier in terms of unexpected costs?
Thanks. Thank you, Sophie. So yes, there have been some unexpected costs at Grand Gulf. They've also been a lot of unexpected outages, which then increase the delivered cost of energy from that power plant. So, I mean, Grand Gulf is, I think there's multiple litigation at the state level, at FERC, at the appellate court. I'm not even sure where it is at this stage. It is a very entangled issue, so I don't want to step out of line here, but I think the causes of those unexpected costs are unrelated to fuel costs. And my statement earlier was more about just the stability of the fuel cost.
All right, thank you. And then just to return to the topic of efficiency ratio generally, would you guys expand on some of the benefits and risks?
Sure. How about we do it this way? How about Albert, you can talk about benefits, and Kaya, you can talk about risks. All right, Albert, go ahead.
Sure. One of the things that the efficiency ratio does is it uses numbers that are actuals instead of forecasts. So you're comparing the current period actual fuel cost to generate a megawatt hour versus last year's fuel cost. And you're going to see if it improved or not, meaning the efficiency got better or worse. The benefit, of course, is you don't have any possibility of gaming a forecast. And the accounting is simple, saves a lot of time. You don't have to go through the expenses of preparing a forecast and getting that approved and working with deadbands or any other accounting because you're already doing the accounting naturally. So that's one of the big attractions. The second is it forces you to deal with the reality of variable fuel costs of different technologies. Natural gas is way more price volatile than coal, and those are the two big fossil ones. And then it forces a utility to make that analysis and those choices with some exposure to the outcome. So hopefully they do a good analysis. And it generally forces the utility to think about how to improve every single year, because the new ratio that's set in the current evaluation year becomes the base for the following year. So there's constant pressure to be as efficient as possible, or they risk having an impact on cost and earnings. So those are the primary benefits. Kaya?
Yeah, in terms of drawbacks, I mean, one is that it is true that this should be more straightforward in many ways to measure than relying on a forecast. There's still maybe just some estimation involved depending on what you're including in the fuel cost. If you're including purchase power cost and things where the fuel cost isn't broken out separately, there may still be some need to estimate pieces of it. But overall, as Albert said, it should be kind of easier from an accounting perspective than some other options. In terms of drawbacks, I think that probably the biggest one is that the thing that customers care about is fuel cost, and cost is a function of two different things, price and quantity. And if you're basically normalizing for quantity, what you're left with is a unit cost, which is largely determined by the price of fuel. So the efficiency ratio doesn't necessarily incentivize the utility to look for ways to reduce total fuel so much as basically wants to lower the cost per megawatt produced. And you can lower the cost by megawatt by finding a better, price for the fuel. So negotiating harder for a better price. That's good. You could also, though, produce more megawatt hours and have the same overall cost and end up with an improving metric too. So you might end up with some funny incentives potentially. This may or may not be an actual real world issue. I think it depends, but it is possible that, like, if the utility, say, could basically produce more megawatt hours at a lower cost time, it could actually improve its efficiency ratio. And while it's probably not going to be the case that the utility is going to intentionally go and try to be less efficient, there may be less of an incentive for it to try to be more efficient, say by implementing energy efficiency measures at lower cost hours, which could actually be many of the hours of the day if the cost distribution per unit is variable, which it tends to be in the electric sector, because you'll have a few hours of the year that do tend to have abnormally high costs, especially if you're buying on the wholesale market. So there could be some potential issues there. I think any regulator that's looking at potentially implementing an efficiency ratio, which is basically just a performance incentive mechanism based on the unit cost, can kind of work through those and consider whether those downsides are, likely to result in real world impacts or not, And you can also look at different ways to structure the efficiency ratio, because the efficiency ratio by definition uses a metric of dollars per megawatt hour. So like a unit cost metric, but you could actually create a performance incentive mechanism that employs that metric in different ways. And the one that we've kind of thought about most is using this in a similar way to fuel cost sharing, where you're just basically doing fuel cost sharing on a per unit per megawatt hour basis, but you could have different structures as well.
Yeah, I think this brings up a good point, which I'll mention now, which is some of these policies can be done complementary to one another. Like you can have an efficiency ratio and improve your procurement practices and have more transparency in fuel contracts, right? Some of these things are not only not mutually exclusive, they're complementary when you include multiples. So, particularly for those who maybe have, no transparency and no fuel cost sharing, maybe the first step is the transparency. And then once you have more transparency and better procurement practices, you can see where the utility is really struggling to manage fuel costs. Is it the total fuel costs that are the problem? Is it, the fact that load is growing so rapidly because of XYZ issue that's why they're having a hard time with cost controls? Well, then maybe, XYZ policy is going to be a better fit for that state, that utility. So it's really, there's a reason why we didn't say this is the best way to manage fuel costs, because, the best way for, not just a state, but for utilities within a state could vary.
Thank you for that nuance there. A question about access to information. Can you suggest any report or source of information where one can compare Canadian utilities in terms of coal and natural gas price? Apparently the IEA has that for North America, but not Canada specifically.
Yeah, I am not an expert on data sources for Canada utilities. So, Kaya, Albert, any insights on where to get good data for Canadian utilities?
Sorry, I'm in the same boat you are.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at the hub prices for gas that I forget, I'm not an expert on this area either, but you can look at those for some places in Canada. But yeah, I don't happen to know for like actually comparing between utilities themselves and what they're paying. I'm not sure.
Every time I work with our international colleagues, I always, thank the lucky stars that the EIA is as good as it is in terms of collecting and reporting a tremendous amount of data that is not available everywhere else. So sorry, we couldn't be more helpful.
All right. And let's see here. It looks like we have a reference for that last question, which is fantastic. But Joe, I believe that we have run out of questions at this point.
All right. Well, then I will call to the group if there's any additional questions to go ahead and put them in the Q&A function in Zoom. And while we wait to see if there are additional ones, Kaya, it looks like you want to say something, so I'll go ahead and throw it to you.
I'm just noticing, looking at the Q&A function here, that the question about the Canadian utilities appears to be from somebody that was anonymous. So maybe that person, if they would like the other person to be put in touch with them about the Canadian utility regulation, perhaps submit another question where you identify yourself in some way. And if not, that's fine. But just for being able to connect folks.
Thank you, Kaya. So I'll just add. Oh, there looks like there's been a couple of additional questions. So,
yes. So, what arguments do you anticipate against fuel cost sharing, and do you have thoughts on how to respond to those? An example might be more frequent rate cases, increases to utility borrowing costs, etc.
Sure. This might be a good round robin for all three of us. I got the privilege to present to this on this paper at NARUC, and the American Gas Association was one of the other panelists. And the two things that they really harped on were, one, we are not a price setter. Our members are not price setters. We do not set the price of gas. We have no control over it. And they're in some ways true that they don't set the price of gas, but they are the number one consumer of natural gas. The industry is the number one consumer of natural gas. They are the ones building the power plants, signing the contracts, negotiating the terms, and making all the operational decisions. So while the utility might not be able to set the price, they have more levers and options available to them to control those prices than any retail customer does. Retail customers, unless they have, some sort of tariff that they can opt into to manage those fuel costs, they're exposed to whatever the utility decides to do. So ultimately, the utility should be the responsible party for managing these costs. The other thing they said was to remove the fuel cost trackers would be to be an incredible, astronomical, hyperbole level increase in risk, and therefore need a subsequent and equal increase in ROE. And I will happily defer to Albert to respond to that ROE argument. But those are the two primary arguments I have heard outside of PUC dockets where you're litigating specific fuel decisions. Albert, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. In addition to what Joe said, one of the most common arguments that major natural gas heavy utilities say is removing the fuel clause adjustment implies that they are not doing their best, that it implies there's some ethical breach or something wrong, that the utility just won't buy into that. And I think the response to that is it's not true. No one's arguing or accusing anyone of doing anything wrong. In fact, the natural motivation for moral hazard is that when you have no financial variation in the outcome, you should not spend a lot of time worrying about the variables that affect that outcome. You owe that to your shareholders as a duty to them at a minimum. So I think the bigger issue and response is we're looking at this after 70 years because the world has changed and there's a lot of low and no fuel options that can help us manage the system much more efficiently. But the key player, the utility, needs to buy into that view that the world has changed, because passing through all the fuel cost is going to continue to persist as a practice unless we actually start to address and come to grasp with that reality. So I think that's one of the main things we hear a lot about. The efficiency ratio in part was thought up of because it also invites the utility to benefit. And in this case, for being more efficient, because most of the other tools have been sort of regulatory oversight with punishment for stepping out of line, disallowances, things that the utility view as all downside. So they have a history of regarding fuel cost sharing ideas as sort of only punitive. And we're trying to think of ways to bring them to the table and say, let's have a rational discussion about it, to where if you get better, the system gets better and customers save money and get better as well. So, those are kind of my responses to that topic and question. Kaya?
Yeah. And I think that this comes back in part to basically wanting to be careful about what level you set that sharing percentage at. So in terms of fuel cost sharing, certainly if you get rid of, if you go to the extreme and you remove the trope completely, a typical utility that is pretty reliant on natural gas, maybe some coal and what have you, the level of risk might be too much for it to reasonably bear without its borrowing costs going up. And I think that is true if you were to suddenly implement that there could be those sorts of issues. But if you're implementing fuel cost sharing, as the question asked about, you don't have to go to 100% sharing. You can go to something much lower, and you can look at the utilities generation mix. You can look at historically what the volatility of those costs have been. You can run some sensitivity analyses saying, well, in a hypothetical future scenario where we have a global disruption of gas production because of another war in Ukraine or whatever it is, and some kind of big shock happens, how big of an impact is that likely to have on the utilities finances? And you can work through that analysis. And if you find that, if we implement, say, 10% sharing, that's going to be it's going to add too much risk to the utility, you can reduce that to 5%, or you can reduce that even to, say, 2%, which is what in Hawaii the utility has been operating under. So, I think there's some flexibility there. And while, it is true that if you expose the utility to more risk, it will by nature be exposed to more risk, and that may possibly translate into higher borrowing costs. It's not for certain, because it depends on whether there's some kind of a buffer there right now, if the utility could actually obtain capital at lower cost than it's currently doing. But eventually you would assume that risk would translate into some higher costs. So I think the question there for regulators is really like, we think, because of this moral hazard issue, because of the weak incentives to contain costs now, that customers are paying more for fuel than they need to be. And so if the concern about higher borrowing costs ultimately comes down to customers as well. Customers will ultimately pay more for that if the utility truly must pay more to lenders and to investors in order to obtain capital. And so you have to work through that and just think, well, where's that happy medium? How do you balance those concerns for the customer's best interest in order to reduce their costs from either source of overpaying?
Yeah. Like Taya said, I think in some places you're going to see that there's, the ROE is already perhaps above what their cost of capital plus, might be. How do I want to put this? Pearl Street and RMI has done some analysis looking at ROEs and historical benchmarks for what ROE should track with. And our conclusion was that a lot of utilities have above ROE, like ROEs that are above what we would have expected. So there might be some, proverbial fat that could, that might need to be trimmed. And this is a way to sort of realign those risks. The other thing, which is, something I want to reiterate that Kaya said is, these policies can change over time. Hawaii is looking at changing its fuel sharing percentage. Missouri just finished a proceeding, and in there, their consumer advocate asks, is 5% enough? Are we really getting the benefits of fuel cost sharing at such a low sharing percentage? I think that's like exactly the right question to be asking, is what is the right amount? And what you expect is, if you start off at 5%, the utilities are going to avoid the most volatile fuels. They're going to secure a lot more stability in their fuel contracts. And then you actually can increase the fuel cost sharing and ratchet it up over time, because you're affecting the decision-making and able to eventually move to a much higher fuel cost sharing, because the utility isn't reliant on volatile fuels anymore. So there's a feedback loop that you can play on.
All right, and it looks like we are at the hour.
All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us. A recording of this will be sent around to those who register. Feel free to circulate within your organizations, to your state commissioners, to your state legislators if you see fit, to your friends and family, anyone you want to share this information with. We're happy to get it out, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. So thank you so much.